October 25, 1944, 0652 hours. Off the coast of Samar Island, Philippines, the most powerful naval force ever assembled in the Pacific was bearing down on a handful of American destroyers that Japanese admirals had dismissed as tin cans, fragile, expendable vessels hardly worth the ammunition to sink them. Within 3 hours, those same admirals would watch in disbelief as their unstoppable armada turned and fled, leaving behind 4 carriers sunk and their entire battle plan in ruins. What happened in those waters that morning wasn't just a naval engagement. It was the moment when Japanese naval doctrine, built on decades of battleship supremacy and cultural certainty, collided with an American innovation so simple, so audacious, that Tokyo's war planners had never even considered it possible. The weapon that would shatter the Imperial Japanese Navy's confidence didn't involve new technology. It involved old destroyers doing something no naval manual said they could survive, and changing the mathematics of naval warfare forever. The transformation of American destroyer tactics had its roots in a crisis that stretched back 18 months to the naval disasters of 1942 and early 1943. The Imperial Japanese Navy had entered the Pacific War with what naval historians universally acknowledged as the world's most formidable surface fleet. At the heart of Japanese naval power stood the Yamato-class battleships. The Yamato and her sister ship Musashi displaced 72,000 tons fully loaded, making them the largest battleships ever constructed. Their main armament consisted of 9 460mm guns, 18.1 inches, capable of firing 3,200-pound armor-piercing shells to a range of 45,000 yards, approximately 25 miles. Japanese naval doctrine, codified in the 1930s and refined through the China conflict, centered on the concept of Kantai-Kessen, the decisive fleet engagement. This doctrine held that victory would come through a single, climactic battle between battleship forces. Every element of Japanese naval construction and training served this vision. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, commanding the combined fleet until his death in April 1943, had built his strategy around this core belief. Despite his innovation in carrier warfare at Pearl Harbor, Yamamoto and his successors remained convinced that battleships would decide the Pacific War's outcome. The massive investment in Yamato and Musashi, each costing approximately 250 million yen, roughly 1/5 of Japan's 1941 naval budget, reflected this conviction. By October 1944, the strategic situation had shifted dramatically, but Japanese naval thinking had not. The Imperial Japanese Navy had suffered catastrophic carrier losses at Midway in June 1942, losing 4 fleet carriers and their irreplaceable aircrews. At the Philippine Sea in June 1944, what Americans called the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot, Japan lost 3 more carriers and approximately 600 aircraft along with their pilots. Yet Japanese admirals continued to place their faith in surface combat. Vice Admiral Takeo Kurita, commanding what the Japanese designated as the center force for the Philippines operation, sailed with a fleet that represented the concentrated might of Japanese battleship doctrine. The super battleships Yamato and Musashi, the battleships Nagato, Kongo, and Haruna, plus 12 heavy cruisers and 15 destroyers. This force displaced over 300,000 tons combined. Its combined main battery armament could fire shells weighing thousands of pounds to distances exceeding 20 miles. Japanese gunnery training, legendary for its precision, had been honed through 2 decades of exercises. Fire control systems aboard Japanese capital ships represented some of the most sophisticated naval technology in existence. Against this armada, American naval planners faced a crisis of capability. The United States Pacific Fleet's primary striking power rested in its carrier task forces. But carriers required protection, and the Philippine invasion had stretched American naval resources dangerously thin, guarding the northern approaches to Leyte Gulf, where American forces were executing the liberation of the Philippines. Stood Task Unit April 3, 77, officially designated Taffy 3 in American naval communications. This unit's composition represented everything Japanese admirals had been taught to dismiss as negligible. Taffy 3 consisted of 6 escort carriers, vessels the U.S. Navy designated CV, combustible, vulnerable, expendable, in the grim humor of their crews. These ships, converted from merchant hulls, displaced 10,400 tons each. They could manage 18 knots maximum speed. Their flight decks carried 28 aircraft each, a fraction of fleet carrier capacity. Screening these escort carriers were 3 destroyers and 4 destroyer escorts. The destroyers, USS Johnston, USS Hull, and USS Herman, displaced 2,100 tons each. The destroyer escorts weighed merely 1,400 tons. Japanese heavy cruisers outweighed them by factors of 10 to 1. The Yamato alone outweighed the entire screening force combined. American destroyers carried 5 5-inch guns as main armament. These weapons could fire 55-pound shells to a maximum range of 18,000 yards, approximately 10 miles. Against battleship armor designed to withstand 16-inch shells, 5-inch projectiles were essentially ineffective. They could damage superstructure and disable exposed equipment, but they could not penetrate main belt armor or inflict critical damage to properly armored warships. The destroyer's primary offensive weapon was the Mark 15 torpedo, a 21-inch diameter weapon carrying 825 pounds of Torpex explosive. American destroyers carried 10 torpedoes each, 5 per side in quintuple centerline mounts. Once these torpedoes were expended, the destroyers possessed no weapon capable of threatening armored warships. Japanese naval assessment of American destroyer capabilities, documented in intelligence briefings recovered after the war, reflected decades of established naval thinking. A Japanese Naval Staff College analysis from September 1944 stated, American destroyer forces lack the determination for close-range surface combat. Their doctrine emphasizes standoff torpedo attacks from maximum range, followed by immediate withdrawal. They will not willingly engage superior surface forces. This assessment was based on observable American tactical doctrine. United States Navy destroyer tactics, as taught at the Naval War College in Newport and practiced in peacetime exercises, emphasized caution and preservation of force. Destroyers were valuable assets not to be risked unnecessarily against superior opponents. The Tactical Manual for Destroyer Operations, issued by Commander Destroyers Pacific Fleet in January 1944, explicitly stated the doctrine: destroyer units engaging superior surface forces will launch torpedo attacks from maximum effective range, utilizing smoke for concealment, and withdraw to preserve ships for continuing operations. Maximum effective torpedo range was considered 10,000 yards, approximately 5.5 miles. At this distance, torpedoes required several minutes to reach their targets, giving enemy ships ample time to maneuver. Hit probability from extreme range rarely exceeded 10% in combat conditions. Japanese naval planners, studying American destroyer actions through 1943 and early 1944, had noted consistent patterns. American destroyers engaged Japanese surface forces cautiously, launching torpedoes from extended ranges and withdrawing behind smoke screens. They avoided close-range gun duels with superior opponents. They prioritized survival over aggressive engagement. This tactical conservatism made perfect sense within American naval doctrine. The United States possessed industrial capacity to replace lost ships, but trained crews required time to develop. Preserving experienced destroyer crews for continuing operations represented sound strategic thinking, but it also created a perception among Japanese naval officers that American destroyer forces lacked fighting spirit, that they would not stand and fight against overwhelming odds. This perception would prove catastrophically wrong. The mathematical realities of the situation facing Taffy 3 on the morning of October 25, 1944, appeared insurmountable. Kurita's center force possessed overwhelming advantages in firepower, speed, armor protection, and numbers. The Japanese force could steam at 30 knots. The escort carriers could manage 18. Japanese main batteries could engage at 25,000 yards. American 5-inch guns were effective to perhaps 10,000 by every conventional calculation of naval warfare. The engagement that was about to unfold should have resulted in the complete annihilation of Taffy 3 within the first hour of combat. Japanese battle plans allocated 30 minutes for the destruction of the escort carriers, after which the center force would proceed into Leyte Gulf to devastate American amphibious shipping. What actually happened would shatter these calculations and force a complete reassessment of destroyer warfare doctrine, but only after 3 hours of combat that would fundamentally challenge every assumption about naval courage, tactical innovation, and the nature of maritime combat itself. The tactical revolution that would save Taffy 3 and reshape destroyer warfare doctrine did not emerge from naval war colleges or high-level strategic planning. It crystallized in the mind of a single destroyer commander in the moments before what should have been his ship's destruction. Commander Ernest Evans, captain of the USS Johnston, had entered the United States Naval Academy in 1927 as part of a class that would produce some of the Pacific War's most distinguished officers. Of Cherokee descent from Oklahoma, Evans had graduated in 1931 during the Depression, when naval careers offered one of the few paths to advancement regardless of background. Evans assumed command of Johnston at her commissioning in October 1943. The ship was a Fletcher-class destroyer, representing the most advanced American destroyer design of the war. At 376 feet length and 2,100 tons displacement, she embodied the balance between firepower, speed, and seaworthiness that American naval architects had refined through 2 decades of development. During Johnston's shakedown period and subsequent operations in 1944, Evans developed a command philosophy that departed from conventional destroyer doctrine. In training exercises off California and later in combat operations supporting the Marshall Islands invasion, Evans repeatedly emphasized aggressive tactics to his crew. Lieutenant Robert Hagan, Johnston's gunnery officer, later testified in post-war interviews. The captain told us on day 1, "This ship will fight. We won't run from anything. If we encounter the entire Japanese fleet, we'll engage." That was his nature. Some of us thought he was crazy. Turned out he was exactly what we needed. This philosophy reflected not recklessness, but a calculated understanding of destroyer capabilities that Evans had developed through extensive study of Pacific naval actions. He had analyzed the early war disasters, the defeats at Savo Island, the losses in the Java Sea, and reached conclusions that contradicted established doctrine. Evans recognized that destroyers engaging superior forces from extreme range, as doctrine mandated, achieved minimal results. Long-range torpedo attacks allowed enemy ships time to maneuver. 5-inch gunfire from 15,000 yards was largely ineffective. Smoke screens concealed withdrawal but also obscured targeting. What if, Evans theorized, destroyers reversed this formula? What if they closed to point-blank range, where torpedoes became nearly impossible to evade and 5-inch guns could target vulnerable superstructure? What if they attacked with such apparent recklessness that they disrupted enemy formation and decision-making? The tactical concept violated every principle of prudent destroyer employment. It would expose the attacking ship to devastating fire from heavy guns. It would eliminate escape options. It would likely result in the destroyer's destruction. But Evans had calculated something that Japanese admirals had never considered. A destroyer willing to die could inflict disproportionate damage before its destruction. More critically, it could create psychological effects far exceeding its physical impact. This tactical theory remained untested until 06:59 hours on October 25, 1944, when radar operators aboard Johnston detected Kurita's center force emerging from the dawn at 30,000 yards, 15 miles, closing rapidly on Taffy 3's position. The moment of detection created immediate crisis. Rear Admiral Clifton Sprague, commanding Taffy 3 from the escort carrier USS Fanshawe Bay, faced impossible mathematics. His escort carriers needed to launch aircraft, requiring them to turn into the wind directly toward the approaching Japanese fleet. The carrier's maximum 18-knot speed meant they would be overtaken within 90 minutes. Standard destroyer doctrine dictated that Johnston and her sister ships lay smoke screens, launch torpedoes from maximum range, and withdraw to preserve the screening force. This would delay the Japanese perhaps 20 minutes while accomplishing little else at 0700 hours. Without waiting for orders from Admiral Sprague, Commander Evans made the decision that would transform destroyer warfare. Over Johnston's loudspeaker system, he announced to his crew, "A large Japanese fleet has been contacted. They are 15 miles away and headed in our direction. They are believed to have 4 battleships, 8 cruisers, and a number of destroyers. This is going to be a fight against overwhelming odds." This will be a fight to the death. Those of you who don't want to go along, get out now." No one moved from their station. Evans then gave the order that contradicted every principle of conventional destroyer tactics. "All ahead flank. Come left to course 270. We're going in." Johnston accelerated to 35 knots, her maximum speed, and turned directly toward the Japanese fleet. Not to launch torpedoes from extreme range and withdraw. To close to point-blank distance and engage. With every weapon the ship possessed, the tactical execution of what would become known as the suicide charge, though Evans and his crew fully intended to survive, required precise coordination under impossible conditions. Johnston's engineering department pushed the ship's power plant beyond rated capacity, achieving speeds the design specifications said were impossible. Chief Engineer Lieutenant Commander George Huffman later described the engine room conditions. "We were running hot enough that paint was peeling off the bulkheads. Every gauge was in the red. But the captain said flank speed, and by God, we were going to give him more than flank." As Johnston bore down on the Japanese formation, Evans made calculations based on closing geometry. At 35 knots relative closure rate, with the Japanese fleet steaming at 30 knots in the opposite direction, he had approximately 12 minutes before entering effective range of Japanese heavy guns. Evans used those 12 minutes to position Johnston for maximum tactical effect. Rather than approaching head-on, he angled to attack the leading Japanese heavy cruiser column from the flank, forcing them to turn either toward him, disrupting their advance on the carriers, or away from him, delaying their engagement of the carriers at T0710 hours. Japanese heavy cruisers opened fire at 35,000 yards. Their 8-inch guns, far outranging Johnston's 5-inch battery, began walking salvos toward the charging destroyer. The initial salvos fell short, then long, as Japanese fire control systems adjusted for Johnston's unexpected high-speed approach. Evans maintained course. At 0714, with range close to 18,000 yards, Johnston came under fire from battleship main batteries. The splashes from 14-inch shells landing near the ship created waterspouts higher than Johnston's masts. Near misses generated concussive shock waves that rattled equipment throughout the ship. Still, Evans maintained his suicidal approach. At 0716, Johnston's forward gun mounts opened fire at maximum elevation, attempting to reach the Japanese cruisers at 16,000 yards. The 5-inch guns were firing at the absolute limits of their range, with minimal accuracy. But the psychological effect was immediate. Japanese fire control officers, accustomed to American destroyers launching torpedoes from 10,000 yards before withdrawing, confronted something outside their tactical experience. An American destroyer charging directly into their formation at maximum speed while under fire from capital ships, returning fire despite being hopelessly outranged and outgunned at a T0720. Johnston closed to 10,000 yards, the range at which American doctrine said destroyers should launch torpedoes and withdraw. Evans held his course. Japanese heavy cruiser fire was now striking close aboard, with shell splinters beginning to cause casualties topside to a T0722, range 7,000 yards. Johnston entered what naval tacticians called suicide range, the distance at which even 5-inch destroyer guns could inflict damage on heavy cruiser superstructures, but where the destroyer itself was exposed to devastating fire from every weapon the enemy possessed. Evans continued closing. At 0724, range 5,000 yards, less than 3 miles. Johnston had penetrated closer to Japanese heavy units than any American destroyer had approached enemy capital ships during the entire Pacific War. At this range, Johnston's guns could target cruiser bridges, fire control systems, and exposed personnel. At this range, her torpedoes were essentially unmissable. At T0725, Commander Evans gave the order, "Fire torpedoes. All mounts." Johnston's 10 Mark 15 torpedoes launched in a full broadside salvo at point-blank range into the leading Japanese heavy cruiser column. The torpedoes, running at 46 knots with negligible distance to their targets, gave Japanese commanders approximately 90 seconds to react. The heavy cruiser Kumano, leading the Japanese column, attempted emergency maneuvers. At 0727, 3 torpedoes struck her bow section, blowing away the forward 50 feet of the ship. Kumano sheared out of formation, flooding and losing way, effectively removed from the battle. But Johnston's tactical revolution extended beyond the physical damage of successful torpedo hits. Evans had calculated that by penetrating to suicide range and attacking with apparent recklessness, he would create psychological effects far exceeding his ship's actual combat power. Japanese doctrine, like all naval doctrine of the era, assumed rational behavior from enemy commanders. Rational commanders preserved their forces. They did not sacrifice destroyers in hopeless charges against overwhelming opponents. They certainly did not close to ranges where their own destruction was virtually guaranteed. The tactical revolution initiated by Johnston's charge created immediate, cascading effects throughout the battle off Samar. At 0740 hours, the destroyer USS Hull, commanded by Commander Leon Kintberger, penetrated to 4,000 yards of the Japanese battleship formation and launched a full torpedo spread at the battleship Congo. Japanese action reports, recovered after the war from Vice Admiral Kurita's staff, documented the psychological impact. Enemy destroyer forces attacking with unprecedented aggression. Multiple ships penetrating to close range despite heavy fire. Torpedo evasion requiring constant course changes. Formation cohesion severely degraded. The mathematical reality of what the American destroyers had discovered was brutal in its simplicity. At ranges below 5,000 yards, Japanese battleships and cruisers could not depress their main battery guns low enough to engage the small, fast-moving destroyers effectively. Their massive 14-inch and 16-inch guns, designed for engaging capital ships at 20,000 yards, could not track targets racing beneath their minimum elevation. This forced Japanese ships to rely on secondary batteries, 6-inch and 5-inch guns comparable to American destroyer armament. At close range, the firepower advantage that had seemed overwhelming at 20,000 yards diminished dramatically. A destroyer at 3,000 yards faced approximately equal gun caliber to what was shooting back. Lieutenant Robert Hagan, Johnston's gunnery officer, described the tactical discovery in post-war testimony. Once we got inside 5,000 yards, their big guns couldn't touch us. We were too close, moving too fast, too low to the water. They had to use their secondary batteries. And suddenly we were in a gunfight between equals, not a massacre. At 0745, the destroyer escort USS Samuel B. Roberts, displacing only 1,400 tons and mounting merely two 5-inch guns, followed the destroyer's example. Commander Robert Copeland drove his tiny ship directly at Japanese heavy cruisers, closing to 4,000 yards before launching 3 torpedoes. One torpedo struck the heavy cruiser Chokai in her engine room. The cruiser lost power and began falling behind the formation. Japanese damage control reports indicated flooding that could not be contained. Chokai would later be scuttled by Japanese destroyers, a 13,000-ton heavy cruiser destroyed by a vessel 1/10 her displacement. The psychological cascade accelerated. Vice Admiral Kurita, observing from Yamato's bridge, confronted tactical chaos unprecedented in his experience. His battle line, which should have overwhelmed the American carriers within 30 minutes, had been engaged for nearly an hour and had yet to sink a single carrier. Radio intercepts decoded by American intelligence units documented. Japanese command communications revealing mounting confusion. 0748. Center force to all units. Maintain formation. Do not pursue individual targets. 0752. Tone reports torpedo wakes bearing 340. AM taking evasive action. 0756. Haruna reports destroyer at close range. Engaging with secondary batteries. 0801. Request clarification of enemy force composition. Destroyers attacking with intensity, suggesting major fleet support nearby. This final message revealed the critical psychological error Japanese commanders were making. The ferocity of American destroyer attacks suggested to Japanese tactical thinking that substantial fleet units must be nearby. Destroyers did not attack with such aggression unless supported by battleships and carriers, but no American battleships or fleet carriers were within 300 miles. The only forces engaging Kurita's center force were 3 destroyers for destroyer escorts, and 6 escort carriers whose combined displacement barely exceeded that of Yamato alone. At 0810. Johnston, having executed her initial attack, returned for a second assault. Despite damage from over 40 hits by Japanese shells, including 3 14-inch rounds that had penetrated but miraculously failed to explode, Johnston charged back into the Japanese formation at 25 knots. Commander Evans, wounded by shrapnel, directed his ship toward Japanese cruisers that were attempting to flank the American carriers. With no torpedoes remaining, Johnston engaged in a pure gun duel with vessels 10 times her displacement. The engagement between Johnston and the Japanese cruiser force at ranges below 6,000 yards demonstrated the tactical revolution's full implications. Japanese cruisers, forced to maneuver constantly to avoid torpedoes from other American destroyers, could not maintain stable fire control solutions. Johnston's 5-inch guns, firing as rapidly as her crews could load them, scored repeated hits on cruiser superstructures. Lieutenant Commander Robert Hagan described the gunnery duel. "We were hitting them every salvo. At that range, you couldn't miss. We knocked out their fire control, killed crew on their decks, started fires. We couldn't sink them, but we could hurt them badly enough that they thought twice about pressing their attack." More critically, Johnston positioned herself between Japanese cruisers and the escort carriers, forcing the Japanese to shoot through her to reach their primary targets. This blocking position tactic, never taught in any naval warfare manual, utilized the destroyer as a physical shield. The AT-0825 destroyer hull, hit by over 40 shells and with all power lost, continued firing manually aimed guns at Japanese battleships from 4,000 yards. Her crew, refusing to abandon ship while she could still fight, maintained fire until Japanese gunners finally silenced her last operational weapon at 0830. The destroyer escort USS Samuel B. Roberts engaged the heavy cruiser Chikuma in a gun duel at 5,000 yards. The tiny destroyer escort's 2 5-inch guns matched against the cruiser's 10 8-inch guns should have been no contest. But at close range, with both ships maneuvering violently, the engagement devolved into what sailors on both sides described as a brawl rather than a measured naval action. That Roberts' gun crews achieved a rate of fire that exceeded design specifications, firing over 600 rounds in 30 minutes. At 0855, a Japanese 8-inch shell penetrated Roberts' engine room. The ship lost power and began sinking, but not before her sustained fire had knocked out Chikuma's forward turrets and started major fires. BY 0900 hours. The cascading psychological effects of American destroyer tactics had created complete disruption of Japanese battle plans. Kurita's formations, optimized for long-range engagement of carrier forces, were scattered across 20 square miles of ocean, maneuvering to avoid torpedo attacks, engaging destroyers at close range, and achieving none of their strategic objectives. Radio intelligence intercepts captured increasingly desperate Japanese communications. 0858. Yamato to center force. Fleet carriers detected to northeast. Prepare to engage new threat. 0902. Center force to all units. Enemy composition unclear. Request air reconnaissance. 0905. Tone to flagship. Multiple torpedo wakes. Taking evasive action. Losing contact with formation. The fleet carriers that Japanese spotters reported were the same 6 escort carriers they had been engaging for 2 hours. But smoke from destroyed destroyers, combined with the psychological impact of ferocious close-range attacks, had created the illusion of fighting a much larger force. American escort carriers, which should have been sunk in the battle's first 30 minutes, remained operational. Their aircraft, though few in number and carrying whatever ordnance happened to be loaded when the attack began, made repeated attacks on Japanese ships. The combination of air attacks and destroyer assaults created tactical overload. At T-0918, Vice Admiral Kurita made the decision that would validate everything Commander Evans and his fellow destroyer captains had attempted. From Yamato's bridge, Kurita transmitted, "Center force will disengage and withdraw to the north." The most powerful naval surface force assembled in the Pacific War was retreating from 6 escort carriers and a handful of destroyers. The Japanese had 4 battleships that remained undamaged, multiple heavy cruisers still operational, and overwhelming firepower advantage. but they were retreating because American destroyers had discovered and exploited a fundamental truth. Aggressive close-range attack by inferior forces willing to accept destruction could create psychological effects that overwhelmed material superiority. The Japanese had encountered an enemy that fought outside all rational calculation, and they had blinked first. The tactical innovations developed during the Battle off Samar spread through the United States Navy with unprecedented speed. Within 72 hours of the engagement, preliminary action reports reached Admiral Chester Nimitz, Commander-in-Chief Pacific Fleet, at his Pearl Harbor headquarters, Commander 3rd Fleet Staff Officers, analyzing radio intercepts and initial damage reports, recognized immediately that something fundamental had changed in destroyer warfare doctrine. Captain Ralph Parker, 3rd Fleet Operations Officer, wrote in a November 1st assessment, destroyer forces engaging at close range achieved tactical effects disproportionate to their size. Aggressive tactics disrupted enemy formations and prevented execution of enemy battle plans. Recommend immediate dissemination to all destroyer commands. The Pacific Fleet Tactical Bulletin issued November 15, 1944, codified the lessons under the designation Close-Range Destroyer, Assault Tactics, Samar Modifications. The document represented a complete reversal of pre-war destroyer doctrine that had emphasized standoff attacks and force preservation. Key tactical modifications included approach enemy heavy units at maximum speed along unpredictable courses, close to ranges below 6,000 yards before launching torpedoes. Position between enemy and friendly forces requiring protection. Maintain engagement using gun armament after torpedo expenditure. Accept ship casualties to achieve mission objectives. The final point represented the most radical departure from previous doctrine. Pre-war thinking held that destroyer preservation allowed continued operations. The Samar analysis concluded that destroyers willing to accept damage or destruction could achieve strategic effects far exceeding their replacement cost. Implementation began immediately across Pacific Fleet destroyer squadrons. Commander Destroyer Squadron 23, Captain Arleigh Burke, who would later become Chief of Naval Operations, received tactical bulletin priority distribution. Burke, already known for aggressive destroyer tactics during Solomon Islands night actions, immediately incorporated Samar lessons into his squadron's training. Burke's destroyers, operating in Philippine waters through November and December 1944, executed modified Samar tactics in multiple engagements with Japanese surface forces. Action reports documented consistent results. Japanese formations disrupted, heavy units forced to maneuver defensively. American destroyers inflicting damage beyond their nominal combat power. Lieutenant Commander Frederick Moosbrugger, commanding Destroyer Division 46, described the tactical transformation in January 1945 before Samar. We thought our job was to launch torpedoes and get out. After Samar, we understood our job was to get in close and stay there. The Japs can't handle that kind of pressure. Their doctrine has no answer for it. The psychological component of close-range assault received particular emphasis in updated tactical guidance. Pacific Fleet Intelligence Analysis, drawing on intercepted Japanese communications and interrogations of prisoners from ships engaged at Samar, documented that Japanese commanders consistently overestimated American force strength when facing aggressive destroyer attacks. The December 1944 intelligence summary stated, Japanese tactical doctrine assumes rational force employment. Aggressive close-range attacks by inferior forces are interpreted as evidence of nearby superior forces. This creates tactical paralysis as Japanese commanders maneuver to address threats they believe exist but do not. The implications extended beyond destroyer tactics to broader naval strategy. If aggressive employment of inferior forces could create psychological effects that paralyze superior enemies, then force ratios that appeared unfavorable on paper might be overcome through tactical audacity. Implementation of Samar tactics required modifications to destroyer crew training and equipment. Gunnery training at Naval Station San Diego added close-range rapid-fire exercises. Torpedo firing practice emphasized point-blank range launches rather than maximum distance shots. Damage control training increased, preparing crews for the higher casualties that close-range combat would inflict. Equipment modifications followed operational experience. Destroyers received additional armor plating around bridge areas and gun mounts. Fire control systems were modified for rapid target switching at close ranges. Communication equipment was hardened against battle damage. Additional medical supplies and corpsmen were assigned to ships expected to fight at ranges where casualties would be inevitable. By January 1945. The tactical transformation had spread beyond Pacific Fleet destroyers to other naval forces. British Royal Navy destroyer commanders, observing American tactics and reviewing battle reports, began incorporating aggressive close-range assault into their own doctrine for operations against Japanese forces in Southeast Asia. The Battle of the Malacca Strait on January 15, 1945, saw British destroyers HMS Saumarez and HMS Venus execute Samar-style attacks against Japanese cruisers, closing to 4,000 yards and engaging in sustained gun duels that drove off Japanese forces attempting to interdict Allied supply lines. Captain Manly Power, commanding the British destroyer flotilla, reported, "American tactics from Samar proved devastatingly effective. The Japanese simply cannot cope with destroyers willing to close to knife-fighting range. Their heavy guns cannot depress sufficiently. Their formations cannot maintain cohesion under such pressure." Integration of air support with destroyer close-range tactics created additional tactical possibilities. Carrier aircraft could suppress enemy anti-aircraft defenses while destroyers penetrated to close range. Destroyers maneuvering aggressively at close quarters created targeting opportunities for aircraft, while preventing effective anti-aircraft fire. The evolution of combined arms tactics reached sophistication by March 1945 during operations supporting the Okinawa invasion. Destroyer squadrons coordinated with carrier air groups to execute simultaneous attacks that overwhelmed Japanese defensive responses. Destroyers would close to point-blank range, forcing Japanese ships to maneuver violently, creating ideal targets for aircraft making bombing and torpedo runs. Japanese naval forces, confronting the maturation of American destroyer tactics over 5 months of operations following Samar, found themselves unable to develop effective countermeasures. Japanese tactical doctrine, built on decades of battleship-centric thinking, had no framework for addressing enemies that fought with apparent disregard for conventional force ratios.